The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Members of the full committee who are not members of the Subcommittee on Terrorism and Illicit Finance may participate in today's hearing. All members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. Without objection, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Heck, is permitted to participate in today's subcommittee hearing. Mr. Heck is a member of the Financial Services Committee, and we appreciate his interest in this important topic. Welcome, Mr. Heck. This hearing is entitled Managing Terrorism Financing Risk in Remittances and Money Transfers. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this hearing. Today we're examining the terrorism financing risk for money services, businesses, and remittances. As the Treasury Department noted in its 2015 National Terrorism Financing Risk Assessment, the fight against money laundering and terrorist financing is a pillar of U.S. national security and a strong financial system. It's essential that we work closely together to develop and effectively implement strong, focused, and reasonable laws and regulations to detect, disrupt, deter, and prevent terrorist finance. The threat from terrorist financing in particular is constantly evolving and requires diligent adaptation by law enforcement, financial regulators, intelligence agencies, policymakers, and the financial sector. This hearing will explore the terrorist and illicit financing risks that are inherent in the use of money services business, MSBs, remittance payments, and other value transfer systems, as well as how efforts to combat this activity have unintentionally contributed to the problem of de-risking. The hearing will explore both formal and informal value transfer systems, including the extent to which de-risking excludes entire groups of customers from the financial system, and less transparent, underground, unregulated systems, which are more difficult to track and easier for bad actors to successfully transfer funds. The scourge of terrorist finance isn't a new problem, but I hope that today we can shed some new light on this issue and help inform this subcommittee on ways in which we can help disrupt that flow of money. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today and look forward to the conversation to come. I now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, for 2 minutes for an opening statement.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I want to thank all of our witnesses for testifying today, but in particular, I want to welcome Duncan DeVille of Western Union and also my friend Tim Daly, who I see sitting behind you. So it is the largest money transmitter in the world. It's located in the Denver metropolitan area, just outside of my congressional district. Thank you for being here. We live in a world of rapidly evolving threats and rapidly evolving technology. The adoption of technology has not only reduced the cost of sending money abroad, but created efficiencies benefiting consumers, markets, and the law enforcement community. But as technology has advanced, so too have the terrorists and criminals. I'm certain we already are and will continue to harness new technologies to stop the flow of funds to the bad guys. Criminals will always search out the unregulated channels to access funding. But if we strike the appropriate balance, we can mitigate the concern of this de-risking phenomena and ensure companies like Western Union are not at risk of losing their settlement banking relationships. This would drive all activity underground, only exacerbating the national security risks. So I hope the conclusion we come to today is that we can manage terrorist financing risks associated with remittances and money transfers without destroying the marketplace either through excessive compliance regimes or taxing remittances. Let me also say at the outset, I strongly oppose H.R. 1834, the taxing remittances to pay for the border wall Act, and look forward to discussing further this subject further with our witnesses. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman, Mr. Pittenger, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank all of our distinguished panelists for lending their expertise to our subcommittee today. Particularly, glad to see my good friend John Cassara on the panel testifying today. I'm so grateful for the exceptional partnership he's been with us over the last few years, having spoken at a number of our parliamentary security forums for members of Parliament. Mr. Chairman, this hearing is particularly timely and relevant to my interest in reforming financial institution information sharing mechanisms. As many of you know, I've worked to streamline and improve Sections 314A and B of the Patriot Act, which govern bank-to-bank, bank-to-government, and bank-to-bank information sharing. When we make it easier for banks and money service businesses to talk to each other and better identify money laundering, terror financing threats, we not only improve government enforcement, but we also improve institutional compliance with our laws and support our efforts related to privacy. And in the process of improving compliance, we actually offset many of the concerns related to de-risking and creating financial services vacuums in the very areas where we seek better enforcement. Mr. Chairman, thank you for hosting today's important hearing, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Emmer for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding and for organizing this important hearing. I would also like to thank our witnesses for being here. Your insights and experiences are extremely valuable to this subcommittee and this Congress as we examine the intricate and evolving nature of how terror organizations finance their operations. The hundreds of billions of dollars in remittances and other value transfer payments sent around the globe each year play an important role in the lives of millions. These transfers can help stabilize an individual's household or even an entire economy's finances, and in many cases serve as an important and vital lifeline among family members and loved ones separated around the globe. That is why today's hearing is so important. While much of the estimated $575 billion in remittances sent globally in 2016 went to support livelihoods and the well-being of relatives, these transfers were also vulnerable to exploitation by criminal and terror organizations. For decades, our intelligence and terror financing communities have held that without money, there is no terrorism. I believe this mantra holds true, and I'm encouraged to see the subcommittee undertake the important challenge of reviewing our nation's anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing laws to ensure our regulatory framework allows for the continued flow of money to friends and family members abroad while eliminating the use of remittances as a means to conduct acts of terror both overseas and here at home. Striking this important balance, however, is especially relevant as I represent one of the largest and most diverse refugee populations in the country. Many are surprised to learn that Minnesota has the largest number of refugees per capita in the United States and ranks first in the nation for secondary migration or refugees who have resettled in Minnesota from other U.S. states. The 6th Congressional District in particular is home to one of the largest populations of Somali Americans in the country, a population that relies heavily on the use of money service businesses and other forms of transfer to send money to family members abroad. While an estimated $200 million in remittances is sent to Somalia every year, the channels to send these funds are rapidly changing. The lack of sufficient banking infrastructure and the spread of al-Shabaab in countries like Somalia have made it difficult for money remittance transmitters and financial institutions to verify their customers and ensure remittances are being used for legitimate purposes. Although the practice of de-risking is not a new phenomenon that financial institutions have employed to mitigate risk associated with remittances, I am concerned that the continued use of such techniques may have a wider, more detrimental impact to our ability to track the flows of money to finance terror operations globally. Eliminating funding streams to terrorists and keeping families connected do not have to be mutually exclusive, and I have no doubt we can improve our regulatory system to accomplish these goals. Again, I want to thank the chairman for holding this important hearing today.
Gentleman's time has expired. Today we welcome the testimony of our witnesses. Mr. Duncan DeVille is the first one, is Senior Vice President at Western Union, where he serves as Global Head of Financial Crimes Compliance and as BSA Officer. Previously, Mr. DeVille served as Head of the Office of Compliance Enforcement at FinCEN, as a Senior Financial Enforcement Advisor at the U.S. Treasury Department Office of International Affairs, as an advisor with the Department of Defense in Iraq, and a series of prosecutorial positions at the federal, state, and local government levels. Mr. DeVille has earned his law degree from the University of Denver, other graduate degrees from Harvard University, Oxford University, and his bachelor's degree from the University of Louisiana. Thanks for being here, Mr. DeVille. Next, we have John Cassara. Mr. Cassara is a member of the Board of Advisors for the Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Mr. Cassara began his 26-year government career as an intelligence officer during the Cold War. He later served as a Treasury special agent in both the U.S. Secret Service and the U.S. Customs Service, where he investigated money laundering, trade fraud, international smuggling. He was an undercover arms dealer for 2 years. Assigned overseas, he developed expertise in Middle East money laundering, value transfer, and underground financial systems. Mr. Casaro also worked 6 years for Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and was detailed to the Department of State's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. Mr. Scott Paul is the humanitarian policy lead at the Oxfam, where he spearheads the organization's advocacy on a number of crises and cross-cutting humanitarian issues. Mr. Paul previously worked for the Civic, an organization that seeks to make warring parties more responsible to civilians, where he initiated Civic's work on the conflict in Somalia and directed its Making Amends campaign. Mr. Paul also serves as Deputy Director, Government Relations at Citizens for Global Solutions, where he led numerous coalition-based campaigns to promote a vision of U.S. foreign policy centered on cooperation, pragmatism, and the rule of law. To introduce Mr. Oppenheimer, we have Mr. Heck here. So, Mr. Heck, you're recognized for the introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I'm proud to be able to introduce my friend Matthew Oppenheimer, the co-founder and CEO of Remitly, which is yet another Seattle-based success story of a company. They provide low-cost remittances to Latin America, India, and the Philippines. Matthew's resume is impressive indeed. It combines almost all the issues that make me excited about the opportunity to work together on this committee. He worked for Barclays Bank, where he rose to become head of mobile banking in Kenya. If you understand that, you understand that's quite a success story in and of itself. And he co-founded Remitly to bring fintech innovation to bear on an old problem. And in dealing day in and day out with Bank Secrecy Act regulation, I know for a fact he's got lots of ideas on how these can be made to be more efficient and effective. I look forward to hearing his testimony, and I'm sure that if we all do so, we can indeed find several opportunities to work across the aisle on mobile banking and fintech regulation and Bank Secrecy Act modernization and strike, as my dear friend Mr. Perlmutter says, that appropriate balance. Welcome to the committee, and thank you for making that trip I make a couple of times a week.
Each of you is going to be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. You see the green light, yellow light, red light. It works just like the ones downtown. Green means go, yellow means speed up, and red means stop. So thank you, Mr. DeVille. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Pierce, Ranking Member Perlmutter, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss ways to detect and combat the use of money service businesses, or MSBs, by terrorist organizations, and to talk about Western Union's efforts and how various programs in our compliance umbrella have changed over time. Western Union's worldwide network includes more than 500,000 agent locations in over 200 countries and territories. In 2016, across all our products and platforms, Western Union averaged 31 transactions per second and over 900 per second at peak times. For Western Union, a critical part of serving our customers is complying with regulatory requirements. Even though regulatory compliance costs money and inhibits our ability to drive down transaction costs for our customers, we do not view these compliance and customer service goals as conflicting, but as complementary. Our business model depends upon trust. We cannot build and maintain our business unless we create a safe global environment for the people, families, and businesses who use our services. To that end, Western Union has increased its overall compliance funding by more than 200% over the last 5 years and now spends more than $200 million annually on compliance. Approximately 2,400 full-time employees, over 20% of our workforce, are exclusively dedicated to compliance functions. We've added more employees with banking and legal and law enforcement and regulatory expertise. Our Chief Compliance Officer, Jacqueline Molnar, who is here today, and I are proud to be some of the hundreds of compliance professionals recruited by Western Union in the last few years. Our compliance program is comprehensive and has 12 components. Today, I'll just discuss briefly 2 of those components, 2 that are especially relevant to this committee's work: agent oversight and our FIU, our Financial Intelligence Unit. Agent oversight is a key component of an MSB's compliance program. In designing our program, we have been cognizant that Western Union's retail money service business operates through company partnerships with our network of agent locations around the world. In addition to regional store chains, convenience stores, small businesses, and other retailers, in most other countries, banks and post offices act as Western Union agents. But for those small businesses, revenue generated through offering Western Union products is very significant, and we're proud to help spur job growth and contribute to the larger economy. We've established a dedicated compliance team specifically to conduct due diligence on our agents prior to entering a relationship with them, upon renewal of contracts, and at other triggering events such as a change of ownership. We also provide training and we do field visits. We monitor all transactions that flow through agents. In addition to the back-end traditional automated transaction monitoring I know other witnesses have spoken to you about, which looks for patterns post-transaction on a weekly or monthly basis, Western Union has something unique. We do upfront monitoring. We call it real-time risk assessments. And these are rules and algorithms that are designed to stop transactions before they go through. This is just one example. We hold 26 patents related to categorizing and identifying data patterns. The other component of our compliance program I'll briefly describe to you is our FIU. Modeled after intelligence programs in the government and law enforcement community, our FIU, in addition to doing in-depth financial analysis and investigations, develops and maintains collaborative relationships with key law enforcement and other government partners. For example, within hours of recent European terrorist attacks, our FIU's rapid response team provided actionable intelligence to law enforcement via confidential reports, suspicious activity reports or SARs, suspicious transaction reports, STRs. Providing this type of immediate insight into active investigations has, in at least one case, and law enforcement told us this, helped identify additional terrorists before they carried out more attacks. In conclusion, on behalf of Western Union, I thank the members of the subcommittee for having me here today and for your critical work in this area. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. DeVille. I now recognize Mr. Oppenheimer for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. My name is Matt Oppenheimer, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Remitly, an online remittance provider based in Seattle, Washington. I thank the subcommittee for the opportunity to explain why our country has an interest in ensuring that legitimate remittance services are accessible, affordable, and safe. Remittances matter for the millions who rely on these services, but equally matter as a matter of national security. I founded Remitly in 2011 after living in Kenya and seeing firsthand how difficult it was to send money across borders. Not only that, but it was expensive, costing 8 to 10% of the total transfer just to send the money. Looking at the technology available to solve this problem, I knew there had to be a better way. When I moved back, I started Remitly to make remittances easier, faster, and more transparent. By replacing the cash-based brick-and-mortar model with a purely digital one, we sought to build a better, more affordable service for customers. By focusing on that vision, we have cut the cost of service from 8% to under 2%, putting hard-earned money back into consumers' pockets while delivering a better user experience. I'm humbled to say that our team of over 400 employees now helps customers send $3 billion a year to recipients in India, Mexico, Latin America, and the Philippines. While our technology has improved remittances, the basic reasons for sending money has not changed. Our customers send to pay for basic needs of their family members: housing, food, water, power, medical care, education, things we take for granted here but can be unattainable for millions abroad. Our customers are heroes. They sacrifice to provide a better life for their families. When they send, it's more than money, it's a lifeline. Paying their family's rent or their child's tuition. If you add up all these transfers, you will find that remittances contribute nearly 4 times the funds provided by all foreign aid. Beyond the human impact, when remittances are sent through modern, legitimate channels, they strengthen our national security. As a regulated provider, we invest heavily to comply with AML laws and other requirements, using the latest technology to detect and report suspicious activity. Digital providers like Remitly provide an additional security by serving only customers with U.S. bank accounts and by embedding KYC, OFAC screens, and risk features directly into our product. This creates a more secure, lower-risk service compared to the traditional model. This approach is also a powerful weapon against illegal activity. When our machine learning systems or our trained staff spot something suspicious, we report it. This provides law enforcement with a high-resolution view into global money flows, an invaluable tool in fighting against illegal activity, money laundering, and terrorism. Licensed remittance companies keep money in the light by processing legitimate transactions while detecting and reporting those that are not. By contrast, there is an underground market of unlicensed remittance providers that don't comply with these obligations. These informal networks operate without oversight and can be associated with black market activity. If policies are enacted that raise the costs of legitimate services, money will flow into these shadowy alternatives. That is why I'm troubled by recent proposals to tax remittances to fund a border wall. A 2% tax would radically increase the cost of sending money far more than you might expect. Remitly charges less than 2% for our service, so this tax would more than double prices. Do that, and money will flow to underground channels, funding the very activities we want to stop. The worst thing Congress could do to our customers and to border security would be to tax remittances to build a wall. It's just bad policy. Congress should focus on low-risk means to reduce regulatory burdens and enhance competition. While there's no silver bullet to AML reform, a few lead bullets include revisiting SAR reporting thresholds, aligning KYC requirements with international trends, and improving OFAC sanctions lists to reduce the operational burden posed by false positives. These improvements would focus private sector and law enforcement resources on higher risk activities. It makes sense to reality check our risk-based approach from time to time, so I applaud the subcommittee's focus on these issues. Making legitimate remittance services more accessible, affordable, and secure benefits consumers and strengthens national security. Smart policies and continued innovation put this goal within reach. I thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I welcome any questions the members may have.
Thank you, Mr. Oppenheimer. Now recognize Mr. Kassar for 5 minutes.
Chairman Pierce, Ranking Member Perlmutter, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the
If you
opportunity.
could scoot up a little bit closer to your mic or make sure the red light's on.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. It is an honor for me to be here. I am joined by experts from the formal remittance industry, so I will limit my remarks to the informal underground remittances, sometimes known as informal value transfer systems, parallel banking, underground banking, or sometimes just Hawala. There are an estimated 244 million migrant workers around the world. Globalization, demographic shifts, regional conflicts, income disparities, and the instinctive search for a better life continue to encourage more and more workers to cross borders in search of jobs and security. Many countries are dependent on remittances as an economic lifeline. Although estimates vary, according to the World Bank, global remittances may have reached approximately $575 billion in 2016. That is an estimate of what is officially remitted. Unofficially, nobody knows. However, using IMF and World Bank assessments, unofficial remittances may be greater than $850 billion per year, with a substantial portion of that originating from the United States. Although diverse alternative remittance systems are found around the world, most share a few common characteristics. The first is that they all transfer money without physically moving it. Another is that they all offer the 3 C's. They are certain, convenient, and cheap. They are all ethnic-based. They are sophisticated and efficient. And finally, historically and culturally, most alternative remittance systems use trade as a primary mechanism to settle accounts or balance the books between brokers. In my written testimony, I go into some detail how they operate. Informal remittance networks are found throughout our country. The overwhelming percentage of money transfers generated by the use of these informal systems is benign. We, of course, do not wish to interfere with migrants sending money back home to support their loved ones. However, these informal systems are also abused by criminal and terrorist organizations. They avoid our primary anti-money laundering, counterterrorism finance countermeasures. As Osama bin Laden once said, jihadists are aware of the quote-unquote cracks in the Western financial system. Informal remittances are not just a crack, they're a Grand Canyon. There have been many incidents relating to terror finance, both in the United States and overseas. Some examples include the use of Hawala in areas our adversaries operate, such as Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, and ISIS-controlled Syria and Iraq. Hawala was used to help fund the 2010 Times Square bombing in New York City. In 2013, a federal judge in San Diego sentenced 3 Somali immigrants for providing support via Hawala to al-Shabaab, a designated terrorist organization. Hawala is legal in the United States as long as the service is registered with Treasury's FinCEN and adheres to state licensing guidelines. Yet our government's own statistics suggest our money service business registration is not successful. And from an investigative standpoint, it is very hard to penetrate these networks. To use just a few examples, law enforcement does not have many Gujarati, Farsi, Pashto, Urdu speakers, and even if we recruited some sources to walk into some of these networks, the question may well be, well, who's your uncle in the village back in the old country? And if you can't answer that question, they're probably not going to have much to do with you. Because these systems are closed and opaque and based on trust, there are no easy countermeasures. But I do include a number of recommendations in my written statement. These include steps to improve our registration of underground money service businesses, using trade transparency as the back door into these networks, better exploiting data and advanced analytics, improving financial inclusion by lowering costs of formal remittances, and improving training and analytics so that compliance and law enforcement officers and analysts can better detect the systems. I also urge that we begin to pay attention to the worldwide Chinese underground financial systems, sometimes known as Fai Chen or flying money. Once again, it is an honor to be here, and I am happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Kassar. Chair now recognizes Mr. Paul. 5 minutes.
Chairman Pierce, Ranking Member Perlmutter, members of the subcommittee. On behalf of Oxfam America, I thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. Oxfam envisions a world without poverty, where all people are able to enjoy the full range of their human rights. Both financial exclusion and terrorism stand in the way of achieving that vision. Therefore, we need to make remittance services accessible, affordable, and accountable, both to law enforcement authorities and to the families sending and receiving money. As you know, remittances help fight poverty and aid humanitarian response worldwide, but they are particularly crucial in the world's poorest countries and during humanitarian emergencies. Oxfam works in many countries where state institutions and the private sector are very weak or have collapsed. In these countries especially, remittances are a powerful stabilizing force. They help communities build resilience to crises, weather the storm, and then build back better. Unfortunately, we're witnessing a market failure in the financial sector today that is threatening to reduce and obscure remittance flows. Money transfer operators like Western Union or Remitly, also called MTOs, are the primary providers of remittance services to many migrants, and they typically rely on banks to perform financial services for them, including wiring money. But banks are closing the accounts of legitimate MTOs at an alarming rate. Oxfam has commissioned research and conducted extensive outreach to banks, MTOs, community groups, and government agencies to gain a greater understanding of the problem and its possible consequences and solutions. The 9/11 terrorist attacks and 2008 financial crisis created pressure to crack down hard on abuse in the financial sector. In this environment, many banks view MTOs as high risk and are deciding that the benefits of maintaining their accounts just don't justify the costs and consequences that come with it. So rather than manage the AML-CFT risk of their MTO customers, many banks are instead terminating MTO accounts. It's important to bear in mind that high-risk businesses like some MTOs are not bad actors. They're just viewed as vulnerable to abuse, which means they require more resources and expertise to oversee. Closing MTO accounts may in fact be a rational decision for banks, but it likely means a decline in remittances and an increase in the share of remittances transmitted through informal networks, which makes money more difficult for law enforcement officials, regulators, and money senders to trace. Somalia presents a unique and illustrative case. Remittances make up roughly a third of Somalia's entire economy, and are generally spent on basic survival needs. One Somali American I interviewed told me, "Without the money we're sending them, I don't think the entire Somali nation would exist." Another confessed to me tearfully that the thought of not being able to send money to his sick mother for food and medicine made him consider going back to face drought and conflict. "I can't even eat thinking about it," he told me. Because of the security situation, most international banks and well-known MTOs are no longer present in Somalia, leaving only lesser-known Somali MTOs operating in the U.S. as a viable option. These MTOs are registered, examined, and regulated. They have collaborated with law enforcement during prosecutions of al-Shabaab supporters. Nonetheless, banks have closed nearly all of their accounts, forcing them to find alternatives that make remittances more costly and much less secure. Let's remember, banks will manage risk in the right circumstances. In today's business environment, banks have thought it prudent to participate in multi-billion-dollar money laundering schemes, yet barely offer any service to MTOs whose core business is the transmission of $50 or $100 each month to a migrant who wants to build a better life for her family. It's obvious that the size and profitability of a customer matters a great deal to its bank. U.S. law and regulation have made the costs and consequences of managing money laundering and terrorist financing a lot steeper, but the revenue potential of MTOs for banks, particularly small MTOs, remains very low. I would urge this subcommittee to work with the Treasury Department, State Department, USAID, and the federal banking agencies to refine the risk-based approach in order to encourage more investment in risk management and less risk avoidance, including of MTOs operating in high-risk jurisdictions. That will mean more money in the hands of people looking to escape poverty and less opportunity for terrorists and other financial criminals to transact business. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pell. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for questions. So without getting too deep into it, last year, about a year ago, I found myself in the middle of Bangladesh in the middle of the night needing cash to fill up a small airplane that needed to fly to Muscat, Oman, where I needed cash again. So finding that black and gold logo was somewhat reassuring. I didn't actually use it, but something about hitting the ATM machine in the middle of the night from Bangladesh and then Muscat, Oman caused some alarm back in the U.S. and caused those cards to be summarily dismissed and turned off. So again, thanks for what each of you do, because you serve a very real purpose for real people trying to just do things and live lives. So appreciate that. So Mr. Oppenheimer mentions 3 suggestions in his testimony. Mr. Cassara, have you had a chance to, did you pick up those, basically saying that the reporting thresholds for suspicious activity across banks, non-banks, should be consistent, and then the travel rule update, and then finally OFAC to build more complete updated sanctions list, that sort of. Do you have an opinion on those recommendations, something that you would see to be productive? And if you don't, it's fine. Use the mic if you can.
I'm sorry. At first hearing, they seem very reasonable to me, but I have
You'd
not
like
studied
more
them.
time to look, but there wasn't anything that said, hey, this is not, it's a track we ought to consider, is what I hear.
Yes, nothing's there. It's outside the pale.
Okay, fine. Now, Mr. DeVille, first, Mr. Oppenheimer, you heard Mr. DeVille say that 20% of their people spent on regulations. Do you find that much of your time going into regulations?
Yeah, I think I certainly spend a lot of my time on regulatory matters, and we have a compliance team that we hired very early. Our second hire was our compliance officer. I think that one advantage of digital channels is because it is centralized, our regulators appreciate that everything that a customer enters in, there's no human intervention. We don't have a lot of cash agents.
Okay,
and
so
the number of people is less.
Yeah, if I could interrupt here for a second.
Sure.
Of that 20%, you find all of it to be very productive, or half of it, or you don't want to say with the IRS watching? So I don't know.
It's a great question, Congressman, and I think that some of the recommendations that you just mentioned in terms of reducing the number of false positive from OFAC screening, some of that work I think is less productive. And if we expand the number of criteria right now for OFAC matches, for instance, it is name, location, and date of birth. and building the company from day one, those false positives, once they got through our systems and then it went through a manual review, I was doing personally. And we basically collect additional information from the customer to make sure that it's not on a terrorist watch list. That's not the individual. And so I think that some of the recommendations about expanding that criteria so that can be automated and collected and screened in an automated fashion so good customers don't go through that false positive experience and we still catch nefarious activity. That's important.
I just need to keep moving here. Mr.
Yeah, of
Bill,
course.
if you want to answer the same question, what percent of your 20%, what percent of your 20% do you think is really productive in improving the security of the transfer of money, improving your operations, improving the security of your customers?
It's in the current regulatory environment, of course, it's a requirement, but your question is somewhat different. There is no doubt that there is a tick-the-box regime on the part of regulators rather than the things on which I'd like to focus, which is like our Financial Intelligence Unit, which, as I said, provides actionable information to law enforcement. In fairness to the regulators, however, they are excluded from the law enforcement investigations by definition, so they don't have insight into what is really important
Okay, I'm just trying to get the big
enforcement.
picture.
Yeah.
Are the regulations well-directed? Are they not well-directed? And we'll keep working on that. How many SARs do you file each year?
We are actually the largest SAR filer in the country, nearly 200,000 SARs last year and an equivalent number overseas, STRs, we call them generally.
What's the turnaround time that you get?
The turnaround time, we have 30, it's a complicated regulation, but in simple form, 30 days from the alert to file a SAR. Certainly if it's a terrorist finance SAR, we file it quicker and we pick up the phone.
You ever
and
get
call.
responses from FinCEN?
We do get occasional responses from FinCEN. I think a large part is because I used to
Would it be more
work there.
productive if you had a
Yes.
little bit more feedback, or would that?
The feedback has improved. It's easier for me because I used to work there, but I do hear from my counterparts that they wish they had more feedback,
Okay.
but I've been pleased with it. And they've improved it over the last few years.
All right, my time has expired. Now I recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the panel for your testimony today. Let's get this out of the way. So first questions I have are on HR 1834, the border tax or the remittance tax. So I'd like to direct these to you, Mr. DeVille, and to you, Mr. Oppenheimer. And I'd also would want to introduce into the record a letter dated February 3rd, 2017 from Western Union.
Without objection.
A letter from the Electronic Transactions Association objecting to the bill dated May 1st, 2017. And finally, a letter from Morrison & Forster on behalf of the Money Services Roundtable, all in objection to
Without
the
objection, yeah.
remittance tax. So gentlemen, Mr. DeVille, why don't you go first? Talk to us a little bit. Mr. Oppenheimer gave us a little opening about it. What effect would this tax have in connection with your operations?
Thank you, Representative Perlmutter. It's a very good question and timely. It's especially important to understand how price-sensitive the money transmitter business is. Mr. Oppenheimer and I did not talk beforehand, but my statistic is the same as his, that a 2% tax would nearly double, in our case, the cost of the average transmittal of funds between
And do you
Western
agree with
Union
him that this could drive these transactions underground, which would then make them less transparent to law enforcement?
Yes. Almost certainly it would drive them underground. There's so many opportunities underground as it is for even without the tax. And the relationship we have with law enforcement, the SARs I discussed with the chairman, those would not be as readily available from, or if at all, from an underground money transmitter.
Thank you. Mr. Oppenheimer?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Congressman. I think that, as I mentioned in my oral testimony, I think that for reasons that Mr. DeVille mentioned and that we've talked about, funding a border wall with remittance tax would be both bad for our national security and would be harmful for consumers trying to get money back home. So I think regardless of one's views on a border wall, taxing remittances to fund it is just not good policy.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cassara, Mr. Paul, I really do want to understand, you gave us an overview, Mr. Cassara, of Hawala, and I'd like a couple examples. I know you give them in your written testimony, but for oral testimony today, give me an example of how the money goes underground and how it could get to a terrorist organization. Mr. Pierce said that you'd been a gun dealer or an arms dealer at some point in your past.
That was a underground, legitimate.
Underground, I mean, an underground.
Undercover, excuse me.
Undercover, pardon me. So explain to me, I mean, I understood you were doing it on behalf of all of us, and I appreciate that. All right, thank you. So give us some examples of how this goes underground. And then, Mr. Paul, what I'd like you to talk about is what's the effect to just law-abiding people in Minneapolis or Denver or wherever it may be if we really tighten down on this stuff?
Congressman, here in the United States, I believe that underground financial networks such as Hawala are found throughout the country. So, for example, there could be a Somali, and I'm not picking on Somalis, it could just as easily be an Afghan or a Bangladeshi or whomever. It doesn't make any difference. There's an individual that wants to remit money back to his home country. For example, Somalia. Maybe he wants to help support al-Shabaab. There are limitations and real concerns why he would not want to go into a formal financial institution, which I outline in my paper, as well as, for example, a money service business. So he feels comfortable in talking to somebody from his extended family, clan, or tribe, somebody that may be called a hawaladar. He gives him some money that he wants transmitted back to Somalia, back to the old country. The money does not physically leave the United States, it stays here in the United States. The hawaladar here in the United States contacts his counterpart in Somalia. The equivalent of money, less small fees at both ends, are then delivered to the destination that he designates. And that destination could be affiliated with, for example, an al-Shabaab. That money could go for nefarious purposes.
Okay, so the money's here, but it's like security for the money over there. Like having a certificate of deposit that's on loan to somebody who puts up the money in the old country.
Correct. It's money transfer without money movement. In a sense, it's what Western Union does.
But, Mr. Paul, and I know my time's up.
Yeah, I'll just quickly agree with Mr. Cassara and just say, on top of the consequences for our national security, consider also the perspective of the individual money sender. Once that money gets out of his pocket and into the hawaladar's pocket, there's no recourse. You can't sue. You can't call someone who has any authority over the person who's just taken his or her money. That money, for all intents and purposes, is out of his or her hands.
All right, thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. DeVille and Mr. Oppenheimer, do your companies share information on terror financing and other illicit finance threats with each other and with other financial institutions?
Yes, we participate in 314B, Congressman.
Yes, sir. Same as you, Mr. Oppenheimer?
That's correct, yep.
Do you have any impediments or challenges there in respect to that exchange of information?
I know my counterparts at other financial institutions have had impediments. We actually have not. It's worked well for us.
Okay.
Perhaps because we're a bigger player, it could be.
Sure. Mr. Cassara, you have testified previously and also written regarding the trade transparency units. And give us some detail, if you would, on how these trade transparency units can be helpful in identifying illicit financing in remittances, wire transfers, hawalas, and other regard.
It depends on the geographic location of the world, but historically and culturally, most underground financial systems, particularly Hawala and Phi Chin, they settle accounts or balance of books through trade, value transfer, over and under invoicing, for example, sometimes called countervaluation. I've testified here before on the idea of establishing trade transparency units around the world. There are approximately 16 today. We have one here in the United States in Homeland Security investigations. The idea is very simple. Looking at one country's targeted imports, comparing those with the corresponding country's exports, you can spot anomalies. Those anomalies could be an indication of simple customs fraud. It could also be an indication of some form of underground financial system, like a Hawala or a black market peso exchange. Some people have called this a possible backdoor into these networks. I think the Trade Transparency Unit initiative deserves some funding and some more manpower to see if this network could be expanded as a real countermeasure to underground financial systems.
Very good. How then, Mr. Cassara, does trade-based money laundering itself, how's it tied into illicit remittance payments or other non-bank means of financing?
I'm sorry, I did not get that question.
Well, I mean, you're through the trade-based money laundering, how's it tied into illicit remittance payments or other non-bank?
Underground banking is tied into trade-based money laundering simply because it is part of the countervaluation process. And if you include things like Hawala, like Faichen, like the black market peso exchange, like Padala in the Philippines, like all these others, as I said, historically and culturally, they all use trade-based value transfer. So you can't separate them out. All these
I'd like to comment. Well, we're looking for trying to streamline and trying to clarify 314A and B so as to provide sharing and to provide a capacity for financial institutions to be protected, to have a safe harbor in those transfers with each other and with the government. And do you find this helpful? And not just in sharing information, but do you believe it would reduce the amount of oversight and engagement that you have to have with multiple SARS accounts? You could be identifying those individuals or that data that's really relayed to you by the federal government or by each other. Would that be a supportive effort for you?
Yes, if I may, Congressman, it would be. We certainly, like all financial institutions, receive 314A requests. I think the biggest help to us would be if we could share SARs with our foreign subsidiaries. You have a Western Union license in the U.S., you have a Western Union license in Europe. We cannot share SARs even though they're all Western Union. Now, whether Congress would put that under 314A or something else is another question, but that inhibits our information sharing.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, gentlelady from California, Mrs. Waters.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's very important for all of us that you're holding this hearing today. As a matter of fact, this past weekend I was in Jamaica and had an opportunity to talk with a number of the parliamentarians and the former Prime Minister, and they talked about correspondent banking relationships that were not available to them anymore from our major banks. And I had St. Vincent's representatives from St. Vincent's and the Grenadines in my office last week, where they came to tell us they have no bank that will do business with them, and that they can't pay the salaries of the people working in the embassies and pay their bills, and they want us to help them in some way. And then, of course, they talked about remittances and the important role that it plays in all of these Caribbean countries. And so I want to know, why is the Caribbean being hit so hard? And what suggestions do you have? I certainly don't think that taxing remittances would be a good thing to do. It'd be a terrible thing to do. Even for those banks that were, those countries that were able to hold on to some banking relationships, they have increased the charges for providing the services. And So, taxing, I think, would be terrible. And we should all be appreciative of these remittances and the role that it's playing in these countries to help with, poverty problems and education and health and all of that. And so I guess my big question is, can you comment, Mr. Paul, on the effect that this trend is having in terms of the transparency of overall remittance flows, and can you elaborate on the regions where the adverse effects of this trend are more pronounced? For example, you wrote in your testimony that Caribbean governments at the highest levels have raised concerns about the impact of bank closures on remittances flows. What have these adverse effects entail?
Thank you, Representative Waters. It's an incredibly critical issue, correspondent banking. And the issue of correspondent banking and foreign banks' access to the U.S. financial system is very closely related and in a lot of ways parallel to the issues that MTOs have had accessing the U.S. financial system. Essentially, the costs and consequences of maintaining correspondent banking relationships are outweighing the profitability of maintaining those relationships. And the cascading effects of the breakdown in correspondent banking is having horrific effects on remittance flows, on the ability of organizations like Oxfam and other nonprofit organizations to move money around the world, also for trade finance. So this is an issue that absolutely demands the subcommittee's attention. I would say the regions that have been hit hardest would be the Caribbean. Belize has come forward to say they may not have any correspondent relationships with the U.S. at all at the moment. Jamaica, you mentioned. The other one that's come out very strongly is the Pacific. A lot of small island states in the Pacific are finding it more and more difficult to connect to the global financial system, and I would say that's a systemic risk.
Well, do you have any ideas what we can do to deal with this? We can't make the banks do what they don't want to do. They can't say that it's not at all profitable, because actually they can charge, and they have been increasing the charges for quite some time. We don't want them to continue to do this, but what I recognize, talking with those in the Caribbean, is that many of these small countries spend a lot of money in the United States. For example, in Florida, whether you're talking about Bahamas or any of these countries, they come and they do business, they shop, what have you. We should have a good relationship with them, and we should respect the fact that they have to maintain these embassies, and we want them to do that. Do you have any ideas about what we can do?
Absolutely. Thank you, Representative Waters. A few different ways to deal with this. So we have costs and consequences on the one hand, and we've got profitability on the other. So one way to do it is to find a way to minimize the costs and consequences. There's a number of ways to do that. The most simple way is probably just to clarify exactly what banks' responsibilities are when managing risks of correspondent relationships. A second way is to be creative and think about how to create more incentives to bank otherwise unprofitable correspondent banks. But lastly, and I think maybe the most practical immediate step that the subcommittee could take, is to bring all the stakeholders together to make sure that the right people are in the room, and as concerns the U.S. government, to bring in some of the voices that are more inclusion-minded. So the International Affairs Directorate at Treasury, parts of the State Department, parts of USAID that have a lot of equities in this issue but aren't always writing policy.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cassara, can you please explain how charitable organizations fund hawalas? And have you seen U.S.-based charities involved with funding hawalas?
I personally have not seen U.S. charities use hawala, although there were cases immediately after 9/11 where those charities were alleged to have been involved. Again, it depends on the area of the world that we're talking about. In certain areas, in Afghanistan, Somalia, this type of thing, there are not that many alternatives for regular businesses, for nonprofits. They're almost forced to use these underground systems to transmit funds. So yes, it's conceivable that this is happening.
On page 9 of your testimony, you mentioned Iran's form of hawala is havala. On that same page, you mentioned 300,000 Iranians are in Dubai, with reports that billions in capital is invested in Dubai real estate to launder Iranian money. Are Iranian actors using hawala to launder and integrate this money, or do they use the Western banking system?
I believe they are using hawala to transfer funds from Iran into Dubai to purchase properties, et cetera. Yes.
How would they use hawala to launder large sums? I mean, how does that work? I mean, how much are we talking here?
I can't give you an estimate. I don't know whether our government, whether the intelligence community and others have studied that issue. I don't know whether those numbers are available.
You also mentioned that hawala system is based on trust, but that terrorists also use the hawala networks, as ISIS does in Iraq and Syria. The Treasury Department designated the Al-Qatar money exchange in December 2016 as an ISIS-linked MSB. Is there a network of ISIS-controlled hawalas, or was this a unique situation where ISIS managed to gain the trust of non-ISIS-controlled hawalas?
I don't have specific intelligence on this one instance. I don't believe there is a ISIS-controlled network. This is my own impression. I think there are hawaladars of opportunity out there that cooperate with ISIS. I also think you have to look at the whole issue of trade-based value transfer in the region, but most definitely hawala is present in ISIS-controlled territories in Iraq and Syria.
With respect to the unregistered MSBs and hawala brokers here in the United States, is the fact that they're unregistered a function of a lack of federal agents and resources to enforce compliance, or are there other factors at play here?
I was at FinCEN in the late 1990s. At that time, the director of FinCEN commissioned a study. How many MSBs are there in the United States? This happened right before 9/11. The answer came back approximately 240,000 in the United States. I'm sure that number has increased. I believe that the number of registered MSBs here in this country today are probably in the area of 30,000, okay? So if that original study was correct, there's a missing 200-some-odd thousand. Why aren't more registering? There are a number of reasons. Number one, lack of outreach. There are a lot of communities here that aren't aware of the requirements to register. FinCEN, the IRS, is supposed to do much more in that regard. Second of all, it comes down to enforcement. There should be agents knocking on the doors. Why aren't you registered? Why aren't you licensed? And that's not happening.
Is it a function of insufficient resources? Do we need more agents working on this?
I think part of it is resources and part of it's priorities.
Can you explain the mechanism of how wealthy Chinese individuals purchase high-end real estate in the United States through their flying money system?
Thank you for that question. I'm very concerned about Fai Chen flying money and its use here in the United States. There is a lack of reporting on this issue in our government and in open source information. But as you well know, in China itself, Chinese citizens are limited to about $50,000 a year they can take out of the country. And even if they use smurfing networks, family members, et cetera, there is a massive amount of capital flight leaving China, going into the United States, purchasing high-end properties. And I feel that Fai Chen plays a part in this. The same thing is also happening in places like Canada, in London, in Australia, and elsewhere, and we're not paying any attention to it.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney.
Thank you, and I thank so much the chair and the ranking member for calling this hearing and all of your testimony. Mr. DeVille, in your testimony notes that a current area of focus for Western Union's Financial Intelligence Unit is the continued analysis of transaction controls and other risk measures in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Libya to ensure that you appropriately manage risk while at the same time serving the very real humanitarian needs. But as you know, most other American financial institutions are not operating in these countries. They've pulled out. So why do you think Western Union has been able to continue to serve higher risk countries such as Syria when so many firms have not continued, have pulled out? You are alone in so many countries. What is the difference, and why are you able to succeed where others are not able to stay and serve? And thank you for doing it, too.
Thank you, Congresswoman Maloney. I appreciate that, and you're correct. In many instances, we are the only Western institution in these countries. Take the example of Syria, for instance. We have zoned the country off into Zone 1 and Zone 2. We shut down the agents in Zone 1. We apply a lot of due diligence controls to Zone 2. We don't talk about our specific controls publicly, but limiting thresholds, limiting velocity. We also look for individuals who will do a Western Union transfer on the Turkish side and then go into Syria and vice versa, or go from a Western European country. Bottom line is it takes a lot of resources and a lot of data analysis to allow us to be there. I will say in all my conversations with the State Department and the Treasury Department, they are glad we are there because we are, within the constraints of privacy laws, a source of financial information for them.
Well, congratulations, and thank you for your service. Mr. Paul, as you know, one of the reasons that financial institutions have been de-risking entirely from certain countries rather than trying to manage the risk of doing business in that country is the lack of clarity from the banking regulators about what they need to do to comply with their anti-money laundering obligations. And what kind of regulatory action do you think would give financial institutions sufficient clarity on their anti-money laundering obligations so that they can continue to provide essential financial services and humanitarian support? Could you really, and anybody, talk about this? Because this is a problem. How could we clarify it so that they would feel comfortable? Can you expand on it?
Thank you, Congresswoman. As you know, in recent years, the Treasury Department has tried to issue guidance statements, either policy guidance, in some cases blog posts, with the expectation that financial institutions would hear that message and be heartened that they don't have to be infallible, they don't need to know their customer's customer, and that the risk-based approach means taking a proportionate approach in all of these different places, and they should take heart and do business in some of these high-risk jurisdictions. Unfortunately, I think it's fair to say, for the most part, that hasn't worked. I would encourage regulators to continue the program of outreach that they've begun in general, but specifically in jurisdictions that are extremely high risk and at the margins of the formal financial sector, where people are getting pushed out. People might have, nonprofit organizations or correspondent banks or remittance services may only have a single bank account and maybe under threat of losing that account. That's where some sort of hybrid risk-sharing approach might be more useful, where you have regulators being willing to promulgate more concrete rules as opposed to a more amorphous risk-based approach, and actually take on and share some of that risk by being specific about what's expected.
Would anyone else like to clarify in this area, which is a reason why many people are not continuing to serve? Yes?
Yes, if I may, thank you. I think we're on the same page. More specifically, if we could have joint guidance from all the regulators on the requirements for banking and MSB, I think that would be helpful. The last time there's been joint guidance was 2005 on MSBs. That would certainly help.
And when you say joint guidance, who would all be part of this joint guidance?
It would be, FinCEN did in 2014 guidance on banking MSBs. Maybe that could be a starting point, but you'd have to have the OCC, the Fed, the banking regulators involved as well for it to carry weight.
Mm-hmm. Maybe that's something we can work together in a bipartisan way to accomplish. It's a tremendous challenge for our country, and we have to be concerned about it, particularly in our own country, the money laundering taking place. My time's expired. Thank you. Thank you for having the hearing.
The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Oppenheimer and Mr. DeVille, and I'm going to put it in more simplistic terms and give you a little bit of room to run. And I don't care who starts, but can you give the committee a better understanding of the current regulatory environment for money transmitters from an industry perspective?
I think it sort of segues from the last question. The current environment is, I think, difficult for the banks in many ways because there is a lack in some ways of what is a clear guidance on the part of what MSBs have to comply with. So that's a problem from the banks. Another issue is just divorcing the de-risking argument from this, which we've been talking about, is very often at an MSB, we have to extrapolate from banking regulations because oftentimes there are not specific regulations for MSBs. So more clarity there would certainly be helpful as well. I think probably the main point from my perspective at Western Union is the lack of a level playing field in the MSB industry. Mr. Cassara mentioned the registered MSBs. As of yesterday, there were 25,939 registered MSBs, but as you said, I mean, there are countless unregistered MSBs. And both the smaller registered MSBs and certainly the unregistered MSBs frankly, do not get examined. And so there is not a level playing field. Let's forget about Western Union because I'm biased, but there's not a level playing field between them and a PayPal, Zoom, MoneyGram, Remitly, those like us.
Mr. Oppenheimer, anything to add?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think that the environment is, for registered money services businesses, is one that is robust. I think that there's a lot of work in the industry around streamlining the various regulators we have, which I think efforts to do that are welcome. And I think that we are regulated by both state agencies, and then we also obviously register with FinCEN. We're also under the purview of CFPB. So the more streamlining that can happen, partnering between regulators, the states are doing a lot of streamlining between various state agencies, I think is welcome. And I think that the other thing is aligning bank and non-bank regulations, and I mentioned some of that in my written testimony.
By the way, Mr. Oppenheimer, has your company ever had to deal with the issue of de-risking?
We have. When I started the company, in Boise, Idaho, when I came back from Kenya, from Boise originally, I set up a bank account and filled out on the form that I was a money transmitter. It took the bank about 6 months to go through their internal process, but after that point, we had raised about $750,000 in capital to get the business off the ground. We had not processed a single transaction, but they went through the process, saw we were an MSB, and I get a letter in the mail saying, we saw that you're a money transmitter. We're going to be mailing the balance on your account to the registered address. Thanks for being a customer. And those experiences, I think, happen to a lot of money services businesses. Thankfully, I knew about de-risking, and so I've been working to get a redundant bank account. We transferred it over, and now we have multiple bank accounts. But I think the story that we experience, there's countless stories out there for MSBs that are not able to get bank accounts and unfortunately just have to shut down.
Mr. DeVille, same question. Has Western Union dealt with de-risking?
We have. I mean, as one of the bigger players, it doesn't perhaps affect us as much, but you know, Mr. Cassara said earlier that the way Western Union settles up is like a hawala. Well, aside from our compliance, and I know you didn't mean that, huge compliance program, there is a difference. We require a correspondent bank to settle between us in Denver and our agents overseas, so that's where our de-risking risk comes in. And then for our agents, who are not as big, of course, they certainly face a de-risking risk as well, if you will.
Well, and I'm sorry that I'm picking on these two, but I'm going to stick with it because I'm interested to know if I asked you about the regulatory environment to start with. So now with de-risking, how much does the regulatory environment actually impact de-risking? And I mean, Mr. Oppenheimer or Mr. DeVille, or are there two?
Well, I'll give you an example. Mr. Paul's organization, Oxfam, obviously a very reputable organization, and it's a customer of ours. They have 11 accounts with us. I pulled the numbers, and we had to do 77 investigations on Oxfam last year because of alerts. We knew Oxfam was good, but you can't just put it aside. A regulator's going to come and look and say, why did you not file a SAR? So that's a perspective from the other side. As opposed to us being de-risked, it's our view into perhaps de-risking a good customer like Oxfam. So it's quite expensive to have a high-risk customer, be it an MSB or a charity.
I see my time has expired. At this point, the chair will recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all our witnesses for your testimony today. Mr. Paul, one thing that I sort of find missing in this discussion is the human element. As you mentioned in your testimony, remittances are particularly important to developing countries, and for one thing, remittances have helped lift millions out of poverty and thereby unquestionably saved hundreds of thousands of lives through access to medical care, et cetera, that would not otherwise be available. A recent study conducted by the UN International Fund for Agricultural Development stated that approximately 200 million migrants globally send more than $445 billion in 2016 as remittances back to their families, and there's a lot of good that is done by that money when it arrives in poor countries. And in many cases, the majority of this money just helps people meet their most basic needs: food, shelter, education, medical treatment. Remittances also play a crucial role during humanitarian emergencies, particularly in institutions where state institutions and the private sector have unfortunately failed. However, despite being viewed, as by and large law-abiding consumers, financial institutions have increasingly moved to de-risk the accounts perceived to be higher risk, often with a sort of broad brush approach that restricts many consumers from any access to financial services. And while effective BSA and AML compliance is important, the remittance services, as you stated in your testimony, must be accessible, affordable, and accountable. And can you just talk briefly about the human impact of such wholesale and broad brush de-risking?
Thank you, Congressman Foster. I've had the privilege now in my 5.5 years with Oxfam to travel to regions around the world where people have been able to benefit from different kinds of financial inflows, foreign direct investment, remittances, U.S. development and humanitarian assistance. Each has its comparative advantage, but one of the most interesting things about remittances is it's entirely in the hands of the recipients. It gives people an incredible amount of agency over their lives. It's more insulated from global economic shocks and stresses, not completely insulated, but more insulated, and more insulated also from political shifts than, say, foreign assistance flows. So really, it's the sort of financial inflow that allows people to identify their most immediate needs, and I've seen that recently in humanitarian emergencies in 3 countries facing famine: Nigeria, Somalia, and Yemen, where remittances are essentially the firewall from destitution and death, and also in places where remittances enable people to identify their most promising opportunities, be it a college education or a small business or investment in a family member. So it's been really amazing to see that.
Well, thank you, because we have to bear that in mind. My next question, I guess, is probably directed to Mr. DeVille and Mr. Oppenheimer, which is, what fraction of all of the uncertainties and liabilities that you have to deal with have to do with identity fraud? And either at the host country end or the home country end, and would some sort of approach where having a high-quality authenticated digital ID on both ends of the transaction in exchange for some sort of legal safe harbor, is there a useful arrangement to be made along those lines?
Yes, certainly, and I understand it's a controversial issue, a national ID, but we accept, we'll view, in some cases, record an ID, and we do checks. Our templates are designed if it's a California ID and there are the wrong number of digits in it, the transaction will be rejected. But we don't have a means other than that to determine the validity of the ID, at least not in the U.S., so that would be enormously helpful.
Well, and also you're talking about a lot of these are immigrants. Immigrants are guest workers here, for which presumably the political resistance to having a very high quality ID mandated might be a lot smaller. So, this might not be a solution for everyone, but might be a significant factor. Especially must be more important online than for someone appearing in person.
Yeah, and just to reiterate that point, I'll just add on the systems we have not only help from a compliance perspective, but we also have similar systems in place, machine learning, rules-based engines, that help us prevent any sort of fraudulent attempts to go through our platform.
But those have to do with big commercial databases that know everything about you that are more difficult to use by the federal government.
Ours is an IBM product, so yes, similar.
Yeah, but it's the big databases from these companies that analyze everything produced by your cell phone and everything else that are
The
difficult.
gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel. Mr. Cassara, a question for you. Are these payments in the Hawala networks, are they identifiable by law enforcement and our intelligence community on the blockchain, thereby breaking the tradition of Hawala transfers, not maintaining a record of these transactions?
Congressman, I wish I could answer your question about blockchain.
Sure.
I just can't. I just don't have access to that type of information. But one thing I am concerned about is the fact how Bitcoins and cyber currency in general in the coming years will be used more and more to settle up between Hawaladars.
Okay. Is that valid that there is a tradition of not maintaining a record in Hawala?
They do maintain temporary records. I've interviewed Hawaladars. I've seen they use, again, it depends on the region of the world. Sometimes these are on, Excel spreadsheets. Sometimes they're just paper ledgers. But yes, there are records, but it's not like a bank that has to keep these records, say, for 5 years, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They use them, they dispose of them.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything the U.S. could be doing differently to counter this growth without infringing on the largely peaceful users in the network? And that's for you or anyone on the panel. So you would say that we're on the right track?
Regarding Hawala, no.
Yeah.
We use this overused expression, there is no silver bullet.
Right.
This issue is so complex, and it involves, again, macroeconomics, microeconomics, literacy rates. That's a huge issue. There are certain areas in the world, Pakistan, where about 80% of the people are illiterate. So they do not want to go into a bank or a formal money service business simply because, they're intimidated. It's hard for them to fill out forms, but they feel very comfortable talking to their local Hawaladar. Their tea shop owner that, doubles as the Hawaladar in their village, that type of thing. Okay. So there's a lot, and there's devaluation of currencies and costs, all these things factor in. I wish I could say this is what we need to do, but there's just not that one silver bullet. We have to do a combination of things.
Understood. Thank you. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Lynch. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for your help. Mr. Paul, with Oxfam, are we seeing a heightened use of Bitcoin or alternative currencies in areas where you're doing most of your work?
I couldn't say. I'm not aware of any.
Okay. Let's go back. Mr. Cassara, one of the vulnerabilities that we see on this committee in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, is that, first of all, our folks, our State Department folks are understaffed, number one, but oftentimes there's a mismatch in terms of we don't have enough FinCEN or Treasury staff on site. We did a Codel to the Gulf, and I think we've got one young man who's got 3 or 4 countries there: Bahrain, Dubai, couple others that he's responsible for. Do you think it would be helpful either to train up State Department personnel so they would be more tuned into this situation, or you think it would be better to, and I don't want to put you on the spot, I know the funding issues and all that. Every year I put an amendment in to hire some more folks from FinCEN and give them a little bit of money to do their job. But do you think we could do a plus-up and help us on, in some of these tougher areas where we're seeing some illicit finance going on?
Thank you, Congressman. I think one issue is that there are not enough what I used to call intelligence reporting requirements for embassies overseas in this whole area of illicit finance. I used to collect intelligence, and it was always helpful if headquarters, if you will, would say, ask these questions. I don't think that's happening enough, not in the area of illicit finance. I also think there's not enough knowledge and awareness of many of our embassy staff overseas, whether it be State Department officials or others, about these areas of illicit finance. Frankly, they're hard, and they're tasked to do many, many, many things. Regarding FinCEN, I think it's to understand that FinCEN is not law enforcement. They do not have law enforcement. They have analysts, right, or they have regulators, but they are not law enforcement. I'm all in favor about re-energizing Department of Treasury's Office of Enforcement, which was decimated at the creation of Department of Homeland Security. Customs is gone, ATF is gone, Secret Service is gone. I mean, this is just me talking as an old-time Treasury special agent. I would love to see a revitalization of Treasury law enforcement that could get out overseas and understand these issues. They get the money and the value transfer. That's what they do.
Thank you. Mr. DeVille, I know you talked about your early efforts at FinCEN, and we actually had a role to play in standing up some of these FIUs and financial intelligence units in some of these countries. And so are you involved right now in terms of your private business with Western Union? Are you involved in Somalia at all, or are you completely out of there?
No, Congressman, we are in Somalia. I have the numbers here. We're in Somaliland, and it's been difficult to find an agent in Somalia.
So we have just recently been authorized to go into Mogadishu, but pretty much restricted to the airport and a few other secure sites.
Yeah.
Do you have anything in Mogadishu? Because I understand that the Somali nationals are actually coming over to Kenya, where there's a couple of safe sites and doing their business, remittances and all that. But that's less than ideal.
And it is, I'm sure Mr. Paul can testify, an area that really needs remittance support. But we've been able to find an agent with whom we're satisfied in Somaliland, but we've not been able to find a satisfactory agent in Somalia, so we're not there at the moment.
Okay, great. Mr. Paul, I only got 20 seconds left, but Somalia, any ideas, any answers about how we might better service the people in that area, given the problems with al-Shabaab?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Congressman. There's about a dozen Somali MTOs that operate in the United States. As I said, they're licensed, they're regulated, they're regularly examined, they cooperate with law enforcement. They've now been pushed to the very margins of the banking system. Most of them are unbanked. A few of them have one bank account through which they can transmit some funds. They're very efficient and trusted by Somali Americans and by Somalis in the country, but they need stronger intervention and more assistance to stay within the banking system.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you, witnesses, for your testimony. I really appreciate the things I've been able to learn from you today and from previous discussions with some of you. I'm curious, if you go down the line, well, there's only two that are in the business of moving money. U.S. origin to U.S., we're talking about illicit finance, and we're talking generally from a U.S. destination to a non-U.S. destination, and other times from a non-U.S. destination into the U.S. mostly flows out. And to talk about a portion of illicit finance, it seems to be much easier to get the heroin into the country than it is to get the cash out. That's what they're after. But in a lot of cases, the cash out goes for other purposes. I'm curious about the cash movements between people in the United States to people in the United States. How much of that is happening?
I'll start. Actually, both by volume and by principle, U.S. to U.S. is it's the highest in both, at least at Western Union. And U.S. to Mexico is second, and then you can imagine U.S. to China, U.S. to India.
Right. And so do you have a way to track U.S. citizen to U.S. citizen, or do you track, U.S. person, non-U.S. citizen to?
We certainly track the transactions just as we would if they were cross-border transactions. We track them in the U.S. As I mentioned earlier, there are ID thresholds at which we view we're actually stricter than what the law requires. And then we also have an IBM product called Galactic ID, which affixes a number to every customer, and it's got these incredibly complex algorithms. But if a customer uses a false ID but the same phone number, it would unite those together. So we try to get it gives us a unique identifier to every customer. Not perfect, but it does.
Thank you. Does your system allow you to discern and differentiate between U.S. citizens and non-U.S. citizens?
No, there's no ability to do that short of requesting a passport.
So you create some form of identity, unique identifier to the citizen. I guess my question is, do you assume that the risk posed by a U.S. citizen is equal to the risk posed by a non-U.S. citizen?
In the risk calculation, there's no differentiation made. And of course, when you think of non-U.S. citizens, I know there are certainly illegal aliens here, but then there are also foreigners who are here under visa. So there's no way to distinguish those in terms of risk.
And any of the products you're using?
The only other thing I'd add as part of the discussion around domestic transfers, we do all international money transmission, but it's really important to understand the benefit of having a digital platform, because when you take out the brick and mortar component, customers have already gone through that KYC system to be part of the financial system, and then there's a lot of innovation that's happening to be able to offer customers better solutions. So the more that I think Congress can encourage innovation and getting people into the formal banking system, the less risky it is.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious about the risk, I guess at the most basic level, do U.S. citizens have an increased confidence of privacy? Citizenship is differentiated in that respect. And two is, in terms of risk, if you've got somebody who is known to already be illegal, we can say that their respect for the law is at least different from the get-go. And it seems that your current products don't differentiate. I guess the next question I've got relates to international. And so, Mr. Cassara, Mr. Paul, you guys may be able to comment. A lot of the money transfers that are happening outside the United States are moving through mobile telephone networks, particularly in Africa. U.S. persons aren't necessarily involved in that, so some of the current provisions that apply here don't. What best practices are you aware of that are going on there that give us some insight into the illicit transfer of money there?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. Mobile payment systems have been more or less useful in different jurisdictions, and a lot of that has to do with the telecommunications regulation of the jurisdiction and the interoperability of the networks within the jurisdiction. So Mr. Oppenheimer can probably talk a bit more about M-Pesa, which has been incredibly valuable and useful in Kenya. In Somalia, for example, I've seen a couple of different mobile payout systems, all of which incredibly useful for identifying customers, all of which are incredibly useful for efficient payouts, but aren't interoperable with one another, so they're of limited value.
Thanks. My time has expired. I guess my last question would be, because it's somewhat sensitive, if you who are willing would respond to any gaps that you see in our current system, whether it's inside the United States or with our ability to track it outside the United States transfers, that'd be terrific. I'd much appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the time I no longer have.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair would now recognize the gentlelady from Utah, Ms. Mia Love.
Hi, hello. Thank you for being here today. I know we've talked a lot about terrorist financing, which is incredibly important, but I'd like to focus on a different aspect of illicit financing, namely, activities pertaining to human and sex trafficking. Could you tell me a little bit about the work that Western Union is doing in regards to sex trafficking? In other words, we had somebody from your office come in and talk to us a little bit about how transactions or certain things are set up that raise red flags when it comes to those specific issues. Would you mind telling me a little bit about that?
Certainly, Congresswoman Love, and it's one of the things on which that we take the most seriously. In August of 2013, Western Union partnered with DHS on this Project Blue campaign designed to combat human trafficking. I know you're familiar with it.
Yeah.
We've also, specifically to your question, developed transaction controls that are designed specifically to detect transactions that are possibly related to exploitation of children. Give you an example. Again, I'll be vague because we don't like to reveal our controls because right away the bad guys find out. But these RTRA rules I mentioned, the upfront rules in my opening statement, there are three that come to mind in the Philippines. A payee is stopped from receiving more than a certain number, and we have a fixed number of transactions in a rolling period. I won't say the period of time. We also stop the transaction if a payee is receiving more than a certain number of transactions from senders in a rolling period. And then we also do it by a dollar amount and transaction amount. And there's one example that comes to mind in the Philippines as well, where information we gave, it wasn't solely us, but it was also two other banks, actually led to the local authorities kicking down a door and rescuing children. It was a photo shop where they were being held, and then people were paying online to view the children, as you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
So that was particularly gratifying, and there was some media on it as well.
Is there a way that you interact with law enforcement that is different in the realm of human trafficking than in regards to other, for instance, terrorist activities? When you're reacting to law enforcement, do you see specific behaviors and react with the local law enforcement a little differently?
We established something briefly described. It's called our Rapid Response Team within our Financial Intelligence Unit. And within, there are really two categories to which it'll respond. One is exactly the two you mentioned, a terrorist attack, and the other is child trafficking, human trafficking. And when, as soon as a suspect is identified, within 48 hours, the Rapid Response Team will have scrubbed all the transactions in the Western Union system across all our platforms to look for connections, and we also take it out another layer as well. And those SARs get priority, and we also have a formalized procedure where we will pick up the phone and call law enforcement. DHS is usually the agency involved in child trafficking, other agencies in terrorist finance, and we will call them to alert them to the information we have found. We don't wait for a subpoena.
Okay. Do you think that there's anything that we could be doing or doing better to disrupt and stop the money flow that's surrounded around human trafficking?
The best thing, Congresswoman, would be it's similar to on the OFAC side with terrorist names. If law enforcement can get us names and identifying information, we will scan all our transactions. I mean, we don't wait for that. It's just like with terrorist financing. You stop and think about it. We certainly have the list from the government against which we screen in various governments around the world. But we're also, and we accept this burden, we're also expected to find things that law enforcement cannot based on transaction analysis.
And you're missing parts of the puzzle also.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Even things they can't find, but we readily accept that responsibility.
I wish I can ask this same question. I know that Remittances has been doing some work also surrounding that. Can you tell me just briefly if there are any ways or any type of setups or transactions that you realize have popped up that put up a red flag for you also?
Yeah, I think that we have built our system from day one to detect, I'm really happy you brought up this issue, all sorts of nefarious activity. And similarly, we try to track that proactively, work with law enforcement if we see anything, such that we're a partner in being part of the solution.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here.
Gentleman's
Mr. Chairman,
time
I
has
yield back.
expired.
Thank
Chair
you.
now recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Heck, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I was sitting here thinking about somebody in my hometown of Olympia, Washington, who goes down to the credit union for a remittance, which they may be doing business with Remitly, who has a correspondent bank relationship that then sends it overseas, or it's maybe met by another correspondent bank before it's transferred to a bank. And I just wondered, in the spirit, I think it was, of Mr. Oppenheimer's streamlining observation, what is the particular value add of requiring multiple SARs for the same transaction? Elemental question, but I don't really understand. Why do we need, in that instance, we'd have 3 domestically. What is it that we really get out of that that helps us achieve what we're trying to do here? Anybody?
Thank you, Congressman. I assume you mean multiple SARs filed by multiple financial institutions?
Correct.
Yes, no, this is something I've talked to my colleagues about, and there are duplicative SARs certainly being filed on the same individuals. Now, law enforcement would say, and there's certainly some validity to it, that you at the financial institutions don't see the whole picture. There might be a small dollar amount SAR at Western Union, a small one at Citi, a small one at PayPal, but combined together to law enforcement, they do in fact have value. The other thing is that under 314B, we could share that information, and that's a value of 314B. So to answer your question, often there probably is no value in duplicative SARs, but there are instances where they are needles in a haystack that law enforcement can bring together.
But is it not possible for that data to be rolled up into the single SARs by one of the institution when there are multiple financial institutions involved?
There is a consortium that we've recently been invited to that tries to do that very thing, and it's gained permission from FinCEN for our pilot program. Another example is somewhat related is we are about to start a terminated agent database where we will, with FTC and FinCEN authority, share when a Western Union agent is terminated by us. I mean, they could go across the street and become a MoneyGram agent or vice versa. We have secured permission to have a database where we can query when signing up a new agent to make sure it's not one that MoneyGram has recently suspended. And we thank FinCEN and the FTC for allowing that.
So are there other countries that do things better than we do that strike, in Mr. Perlmutter's words, the appropriate balance between the issues of national security and counterterrorism and efficiency? Do we have anything to learn from any other countries' practices in this regard?
Honestly, I would say that the information sharing, particularly in terrorist finance in Europe, is far less than in the U.S. We really see duplicative SARs after the Paris attacks, for instance, and we've spoken about this publicly, so it's okay. And we diagrammed it where we received from a dozen different entities in Europe a duplicative request where it was clear to us they were not talking to each other. It's much harder to deconflict in those situations. And you can file a voluntary SAR, for instance, in the U.S. In many countries you cannot. So certainly improvement to be made here, but I find it even more problematic in Europe.
Mr. Oppenheimer, you said earlier about considering raising the threshold. I got to tell you, it's been my observation that once a threshold is enacted, it is the most stubborn thing in the world. I think of CTRs, 1972, the index for inflation, holy cow. I also think about SIFIs. And there are a considerable number of voices, myself included, who would argue that what we ought to be doing in the area of SIFIs is looking more qualitatively and not quantitatively, i.e., what's the risk behavior you're engaged in? Is that at all a parallel here? Should we have thresholds at all, or is this about qualitative risk assessment?
Yeah, I think that appreciate the question. I think that the important thing with things like the travel rule, as you mentioned, it is not, I think with the travel rule, been updated since 1995. And so going back and looking at what those thresholds are, in my written testimony, I talk about decreasing the threshold to $1,000. We have to collect right now SSN and passport for any transaction over $3,000, decreasing that to $1,000, but then actually doing KYC on those customers and doing a more in-depth identification process. I think that certainly those rules can be revisited, which would be a good thing for national security.
Thank you. I yield back and appreciate the opportunity to participate, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to thank each one of you for your testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as they are able. Seeing no other participants, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.